To begin the sides, we need to get multiple pieces of lumber so that we can lay out enough 36-inch long pieces to be a width of over 20.5 inches. The first piece of lumber here is about 5.5 inches wide, and there are no large knots or cracks in this board. I'm going to measure out 36 inches and start laying out my boards. On this end of this board, I can get a piece that is about 5 inches. Now the board is 5.5, but once we mill the edges down and clean it up, that'll only leave us with about 5 inches. My goal is to reach 20.5 inches wide, so I'm going to measure out another piece that's 36 inches and mark that out as well. So with this first board, I'm able to get 2 pieces that will be 5 inches wide. And I'm going to continue that same procedure with some more boards until I have a total of more than 20.5. I've laid out each piece of lumber, and with 5 pieces, I'm able to get a total of 23 inches wide. Once I've laid out all of my boards, I need to trim the end on the miter saw and then cross cut it to length. When cross cutting, make sure that you re-measure and don't go by your chalk line. Make sure you have a pencil with a nice sharp tip on it. We're going to measure 36 and cut on the far side of the line. I have cross-cut all my boards to a length of 36 inches, and when I line them up next to each other, I have more than 20.5 inches. After cross-cutting, we want to run our best edge through the joiner 1 or 2 times just to smooth that up. After running our board through the joiner and cleaning up one edge, we need to come over to the table saw and clean up the other edge and make this other edge parallel with our jointed edge. Now our goal is to trim off just barely any, just to clean up this one edge. I'm going to be adjusting the fence just until the saw blade is taking off about 1/8 of an inch, or the thickness of that saw blade, off of our end. If done correctly, you should have under about 1/8 inch of waste material. You will need to do this for the rest of our boards, and we're going to have to adjust the fence every time because each board is going to be slightly different. If you happen to have a board with a knot in it, we're going to adjust the table saw to make our cut on the inside of that knot so we can cut that out and not have that be a part of our project. But again, you want to take off as little as possible. After running all 5 of my boards through, this is the only amount of waste that I have. And if I line my boards up next to each other and measure the width, I am at 24 inches. Now if you remember, I needed a minimum width of 20.5 inches. I'm at 24 inches, and that's fine because we're going to glue these up, and then any additional we'll just cut off later. I'm almost ready to glue. However, I just cut this edge on the table saw, which will leave mill marks or saw blade marks on this edge, which doesn't make it perfectly smooth. So we need to go back to the joiner and joint the table sawed edge to make that perfectly smooth. So when we glue this edge to another board, we're not going to have any gaps in it. So far what we've done is miter sawed one end to clean it up, then we miter sawed the other end to our length. We jointed one edge to clean that up as well, and then we took it to the table saw to clean up the other edge and make it parallel to our jointed edge. Then we went back with the joiner and cleaned up that table sawed edge to make sure that both edges are perfectly parallel and perfectly smooth, so that when we glue these together, there won't be any gaps in our board. Once all that has been completed, we need to lay out our boards for glue. And the first thing we're going to do is take a look at the end grain and draw the way that the grain is going, or the growth rings. Okay? So this one's going up. Now I recommend using pencil, but for the purpose of this video I'm going to use marker so you can see it a little better. If we take a look at our next board, our growth rings are going down. Our next one is going up and down and up. Now it's important to alternate the end grain up, down, up, down, up, or down, up, down, up, down, because the lumber will naturally want to bend along the growth rings. And if we alternate the grain like this, then the lumber will naturally work against itself to keep a straight, flat side, and it's not going to bend or warp on us. Once we have our end grain alternating, we need to take a look at the face grain, because this is what people are actually going to see on our project. I'm going to be using marker on this. I would highly recommend using pencil though. I'm going to draw right on top of the grain to see where it actually meets up on the edges of each board, because we want this to look like it's one big board. We don't want weird grain going up against each other so it looks like it was never one large board. What you'll end up with are some areas that look pretty natural with our grain patterns, and you'll have other areas that just look a little goofy. So here we have kind of some rounded grain almost, and we have some straight grain here. Yeah, so we need to take a look at this and see if we can adjust that. I'm going to take this board and turn it this way and see how that looks. Now, it appears as though we have a pretty consistent grain pattern between these two pieces. However, I now need to take a look down here and see if this is going to look all right, or if that's going to look goofy. Now, you can spend hours and hours doing this, but you have to keep in mind that we're essentially making a big board, and it's never going to be perfect. But we just want to get it as good as we can. If you did a good job cleaning up the edges of your boards, when we set these next to each other, there should be very little or no gap in between them. This particular one, there's a little bit of a gap, so I'm going to go back and run this edge through the joiner to see if we can reduce the size of that gap, because when we glue it up, we don't want there to be a big gap right in the middle of our project. Now when we fit these two boards together, the gap is quite a bit smaller. Once we've laid all of our boards out the way we want them, we're we're going to come back and identify each of our glue joints, 1, 2, 3, so that when we stack these boards up and move to the glue room, we're easily able to tell the order that they went in. After everything has been laid out for glue, we are now ready to glue up our boards. We're going to be using 2 bar clamps, and we have our boards positioned so they are hanging over our bar clamps about 6 inches or so on each side. Next, we're going to run a bead of glue on the edge of our board, and we're going to spread this around so we coat the entire edge. We're going to continue this for each of our boards. Now that all of our edges have been glued, we are ready to clamp our boards. You want to make sure that the ends of our boards are lined up pretty good, and we're going to apply just a little bit of pressure with the bar clamps, watching our boards to make sure they don't shift on us. You also want to watch for any boards that might have shifted up or down. Once our clamps have a light amount of pressure, we're going to be putting another one on upside down. And this is going to help keep the boards from bowing up. And we're going to add a light amount of pressure with this one as well. And then we're going to alternate, adding just a little bit more pressure with the clamps. You want them to be snug, but you don't want to over tighten them. As you tighten the clamps, there will be some glue that squeezes out. We want to come back and wipe that with a damp rag. And you want to get as much glue off as possible, because if you let the glue dry on there, then the next day when you come back, you're going to be scraping all of the glue, and that's a lot more work than just wiping it off with a damp rag. Now, don't forget to flip it over and wipe the glue on the bottom side also. At this point, we need to let our glue dry for 24 hours, so we can't do any more work on the sides for another day. After our boards have dried for 24 hours, we can remove the clamps. And hang them back on the clamp rack. Then we're going to joint each edge one time. Doing this will ensure we have a good edge on each side for cutting our sides out on the table saw. Next, we need to set our table saw to 10 inches. Then we will be running our board through one time with our jointed edge against the fence, and then we're going to flip the board so that our other jointed edge will be against the fence. We now have two boards that are exactly 10 inches wide. We do have some mill marks from running this through the table saw. However, we're not worried about that because these will eventually be put in the CNC router. Currently, our board is 15/16 thick. We need to plane our side boards down to 7/8. So we're going to be taking off about a 1/16 of an inch. During this process, you want to make sure you alternate sides and measure the thickness after each pass through the planer. When finished, my board is exactly 7/8 of an inch thick. After planing my sides, I'm left with a pretty nice finish. If you take a look at where I glued my boards together, it's a little bit hard to tell where the glue joint actually was, and that's what we wanted. Now, after planing my sides, one face turned out pretty nice. The other face didn't turn out as good, and that's fine because this will be the back side, which we're going to end up planing down some more, and our good face is the one where we will actually do our routering on. We are now ready to see if our sides fit into the router table. It should fit pretty snug. If it's too long and the board is hitting on the hold down, you're going to need to come back and miter saw just a tiny bit off. And if our board is too wide that we're hitting on the side, then we need to come back and joint our edge 1 or 2 times. And then make sure you secure the hold downs. We now have both of our sides mounted in the router, and we're ready to choose our program. Now, I've chosen the 09 original design for this particular project. I'm going to go through the process for loading the program into the computer, and then I will be set up and ready to go. While the machine is running, make sure you are sitting directly in front of it so that if something happens where a board breaks or a bit breaks, you can run your hand in front of the sensor and shut the machine off. After the router has cut the first side, it will then move to the second side. Once the program has finished, go ahead and reset the machine, and you can unclamp your boards. The current thickness of our board is 7/8 of an inch thick. Our router cut our outside to a depth of 3/4 of an inch. This means that there is still 1/8 of an inch of material holding all of our pieces together. We are going to remove a 1/16 inch off the back with the thickness planer. This will leave 1/16 holding all of our pieces together. Now, we're going to be running this feet side first, but have the router side down. Now, some of the Quilt Rack side designs have pieces on the inside that will be removed. The router is set to cut those just slightly deeper than our outside cut. So when these pieces fall out, you know that you're getting very close to where you should be thickness-wise. Now, taking a look at the back side after I've ran this through a couple times, we notice that we're starting to show through over here, but over here we haven't yet planed down to our board. Now, we don't want to remove this entire piece on the planer because the planer is a little bit too aggressive. What's happening is there are some inconsistencies in the thickness of the lumber. So here is just a little bit thinner than over here, which is just a little bit thicker. If you get to a point where you start to see some of that outside edge showing, that is a good spot to stop and move over to the wide belt sander. After finishing up on the planer, my sides are at 13/16. On the wide belt sander, I'm first going to be sanding the routered face to clean up all of the edges. If I measure my board with the digital caliper, I have .832. Now the thickness of my board is 0.832, and my first pass should be 1/100th less than the thickness of my board. So I'm going to set that to 0.822. So we're going to type in program 0.822, enter, start. And again, I'm running the face with the routed side first. Now that all of our edges are cleaned up, we can flip our board over and sand the back. My current board thickness is 0.822. For my next pass, I'm going to remove 2/100ths of an inch. So currently my board thickness is 0.822. I'm going to take off another 2/100ths, which gives me 0.802. Program 0.802, enter, start. Again, each pass we will be lowering the machine 2/100ths of an inch. So we're at 0.802 minus 2/100ths gives us 0.782. Program 0.782. Enter, start. And we will be continuing the same procedure until all of the pieces fall out. Now that we've sanded our pieces out, we can discard the scrap. To drill my pilot holes, I first clamped my quilt rack side to the table. I positioned my hole that I'm going to be drilling over a vise so that I'm not drilling through the table. I'm going to take a scratch awl and locate the center of that hole. Give it a couple taps, and that will help me position my drill bit. By drilling all the pilot holes, we have our location for our horizontal supports. After our pilot holes are drilled, we're going to be creating a small radius or a roundover on all of the edges of our quilt rack side, and this is going to give it a nice finished look. Now, because the bottom of the quilt rack will be sitting on the floor, we don't want these feet rounded over because we want as much surface area on the floor as we can to give the quilt rack a little more stability. Now, we are going to round over the inside curve here. Our first operation will be using a table router that has a fence, and that will allow us to get all of the outside edges and outside curves. With the fence on the table router, we're not able to round over inside curves, so we need to remove the fence, and that will allow us to place the quilt rack side around our router. With this type of an operation, you have to be extra careful because you do have an exposed blade, so you really want to watch where your fingers are. The last thing that we need to do to our quilt rack sides is palm sand and hand sand them so they're real smooth. And here I have a little bit of a burn mark from where I went too slow on the router. We want to make sure that we get that sanded off also. Our quilt rack sides are now ready for assembly. To create the horizontal supports for our quilt rack, we need to grab a piece of lumber and lay out 3 top horizontal support pieces and 1 lower horizontal support piece. Our lower support piece will be 4 inches wide by 32 inches long. And our upper support pieces will each be 2 inches wide by 32 inches long. Now I'm only able to get my 1 lower support and 2 upper support pieces out of this board, so I'm going to need to get more lumber. I found this piece here that is more than 32 inches by more than 2 inches, so I should be able to get my additional upper support piece out of this one. I need to make sure and trim off the end to square up the board. I need my lower support to be a length of 32 inches. However, I'm going to give myself an extra ½ inch to work with. On my upper support pieces, I'm also going to give myself an extra ½ inch to work with. After cross-cutting all our pieces to length, we need to clean up one edge on the joiner. Now, because we are running pieces that are shorter than the height of the joiner fence, you need to make sure that you're using a push stick. After having jointed one edge, we need to rip our board to 2 1/8 inches, and we're going to need 3 of these for the upper horizontal supports. Now, because we are making a relatively small cut, we need to make sure we use a push stick. Now, on the table saw, I just cut this 2 1/8 inch board, and I'm going to be cutting another one out of this piece. My jointed edge is along this side, and that was up against the fence. So I cut this piece and that one is done, but now I have mill marks on the inside of this piece and it's no longer perfectly smooth. So I'm going to joint this edge again before sending it through the table saw so that I have a perfect edge up against the fence. Now I have a nice perfect edge to run up along the side of my fence. I have my 3 upper horizontal supports made. Now I need to make my lower horizontal support, which is going to be 4 1/8 inches. And again, I will be using a push stick. Now that I have my 3 upper horizontal supports and my 1 lower horizontal support, I need to come back and clean up my table sawed edge on the joiner to clean off any of those mill marks. And again, make sure you're using a push stick because we are running small pieces through. Once we have our edges jointed, we need to plane all of our horizontal supports down to 3/4 of an inch. Just make sure that you measure your board every time you run it through the planer. You don't want to take off too much and make it too skinny. When finished, your boards should be exactly 3/4 of an inch. On our horizontal supports, we miter sawed the ends, we jointed one side, table sawed the other side, and then jointed the table sawed side so that both sides are parallel and all cleaned up. And then we came back with the planer and we planed both faces of our board. So now our board is perfectly square. The next thing we're going to do is router each of the edges of our board so that we have a nice round over on every edge. Having that round over on every edge will give our horizontal supports a nice finished look. For smaller pieces, you'll want to use a push block to help move that lumber through the router. Since our horizontal supports will be going up against our quilt rack sides, you want to make sure to only route the edges, not the ends. Now, if you remember, we cut our horizontal support boards to 32.5 inches long, but we only need them to be 32 inches long. First, we're going to line up the ends of each horizontal support and trim them just so they're all square. Then we're going to flip our boards around and measure 32 inches and make our mark. When you make this type of a cut, you want to make sure that the ends of the boards are perfectly flush and they're all perfectly lined up. And as we make this cut, it's going to make every single one of our boards to exactly the same measurement. The hole locations for our quilt rack sides for our upper horizontal supports are exactly 1¼ inches apart. Now, the entire height of our upper support is 2 inches. That leaves us 3/8 of an inch on each side of the hole locations for our quilt rack side. We need to lay out, mark, and drill a pilot hole just in the lower location, because we're only putting the bottom screw in first, and then we're going to make our adjustments before we drill and put that top screw in. So I'm going to measure 3/8 of an inch up from the bottom and put a mark across my piece. Now our piece should be 3/4 of an inch wide, so I'm going to put another mark, 3/8, which is half, so I can locate the center for my pilot hole. To help me center my pilot hole, I'm going to take a scratch awl and position that right on those intersecting lines, and I'm going to put a small divot right at that point of intersection. This divot will help make sure that my drill bit doesn't walk when I'm drilling the pilot hole. As I drill the pilot hole, I'm going to be drilling as deep as the length of the screw. And when you drill, we're going to drill a little bit and then remove the drill to clear the wood chips, and drill a little bit more and remove that until we are at the depth we want to be at. Now we need to continue the same procedure for the other side of our upper support, and then as well as our other 2 upper support pieces on both sides. The lower support is just a little bit different than the upper supports. The total height of our lower support is 4 inches. And the total distance between our holes where the screws are going to go is 2 1/8 inches. That leaves us 15/16 of an inch on either side of our hole locations. So much like we did with the upper supports, we need to measure the distance. So we're going to go 15/16. And where you need that centered, and this is a 3/4 inch thick piece, so we're going to measure 3/8 of an inch. To find our center point. And again, we're only drilling the lower hole first on both sides. Our goal is to have just the lower hole drilled on both sides of all of our horizontal support pieces. Once that's done, we're ready to sand. Using a combination of sandpaper and a palm sander, we're going to be palm sanding all of our pieces. We're going to come back and clean it up with some sandpaper with our hand, but you do not want to sand on the end at all. Now that all of our horizontal support pieces are completed, we're ready to begin assembly of our project. To begin assembly, I have one of my quilt rack sides clamped in the vise. I'm going to start a screw in the lower hole of the top horizontal support, and I'm going to position one of my horizontal supports up against that screw and tighten it down. You want to make sure that you snug the screw but do not over tighten it. And we're going to follow that same procedure for all of the other horizontal support pieces. Next, we'll take our other side and line up the lower holes again and install screws in the bottom of each horizontal support. Now when you do this, make sure you line up all of the pilot holes very carefully, otherwise it might split out our horizontal support. After attaching all of our horizontal supports with one screw in the bottom of each one, we now need to adjust our support pieces so we are ready to put our top screw in. Because we only have one screw in, it allows us to pivot our horizontal support back and forth. We want to position it so that it is perfectly vertical, straight up and down. Once all of our horizontal support pieces are vertical, we can drill a pilot hole in the top location. You want to drill the pilot hole to the same depth as the length of the screw that we're putting in. And then we can install our top screw in each of our pieces. At this point, our quilt rack is almost fully assembled. You need to stop and have the instructor check your work. Once the instructor has given the okay, you can complete your final sanding by hand just to remove any small scratches or any other blemishes that we need to take off before we are ready for staining and finishing. After our final sanding, we will be installing some oak buttons in each of our horizontal support hole locations. Using a wooden mallet and a couple of light taps, our buttons are installed. The oak buttons will give our project a nice finished look where those hole locations were. At this point, our quilt rack is completely built and assembled, and we need to start thinking about what type of stain color to use. You'll also want to think about what type of finish you're going to be putting on your quilt rack.